You wake up, check your balance, and nothing seems obviously wrong, yet something feels off in a way that is difficult to explain, because on paper your income may have increased compared to a few years ago, your routine is stable, and you're doing what you were told would lead to progress. But despite all of that, the feeling of moving forward has quietly disappeared, replaced by a sense that no matter how consistent you are somehow staying in the same place, or in some cases, slowly falling behind without a clear moment where things went wrong. This experience is not random, and it is not simply about individual discipline or effort, because what has changed is the structure surrounding your money, not just your behavior. And once you begin to look at the system instead of isolated choices, the pattern becomes much easier to see, especially in the context of 2026, where multiple economic forces are interacting at the same time. At the center of this feeling is a mismatch between income growth and cost growth, where salaries tend to adjust slowly and in fixed increments, while expenses move continuously and often unpredictably, which creates a gap that widens quietly over time. And because this gap does not appear all at once, it rarely triggers immediate concern, instead building pressure gradually until the difference becomes emotionally noticeable, even if it is not immediately visible in a single transaction. If you imagine your financial life as a balance between inflow and outflow, what has changed is not just the size of each side, but the speed at which they move, because your income behaves like a staircase, increasing occasionally in steps, while your expenses behave more like an escalator, constantly moving upward even when you're standing still. And this difference in movement creates a structural disadvantage that cannot be solved by effort alone. One of the most overlooked contributors to this effect is the compounding nature of small recurring costs, which tend to be dismissed individually because each one feels manageable. But when combined across categories like subscriptions, food, transportation, housing adjustments, and digital services, they form a persistent upward pressure that slowly redefines your baseline cost of living without a clear starting point. At the same time, there is a psychological layer that reinforces this pattern, because humans naturally adapt to new income levels very quickly, treating increases as the new normal rather than as excess, which means that even when earnings rise, the perception of financial relief is short-lived, and spending patterns adjust to match the new baseline before any meaningful buffer can form. This creates a situation where progress is not just about earning more, but about overcoming a system that continuously resets your starting point. And this is where many people begin to feel stuck, because the traditional advice of simply increasing income or cutting a few expenses does not fully address the structural dynamics at play. If we break this down mathematically, even a modest difference between income growth and expense growth can have a significant long-term impact, because when expenses grow at a slightly faster rate than income, the proportion of your earnings that remains available for saving or investing begins to shrink. And once that margin becomes too small, it limits your ability to benefit from compounding on the positive side, effectively slowing or even halting wealth accumulation. This is important because wealth is not built from total income, but from the portion that remains after expenses. And when that portion is compressed, the entire system becomes less responsive, meaning that even consistent effort produces smaller visible results over time. Another layer to consider is the shift in economic structure itself, where access to opportunities, pricing models, and even job stability are changing in ways that make financial progress less linear than it once appeared, which introduces more variability and uncertainty into personal financial systems, making it harder to rely on predictable paths forward. In this environment, the feeling of being stuck is often a reflection of misaligned expectations rather than a lack of progress entirely, because the benchmarks people use to measure improvement are often based on older conditions where the relationship between income and cost behaved differently. And when those expectations are applied to a new system, the gap between expectation and reality creates frustration. What begins to emerge is a clearer understanding that the problem is not simply about working harder or making a single better decision, but about recognizing how multiple small forces combine to create a larger effect, and how those forces operate continuously rather than at isolated points in time. When you step back and observe this from a systems perspective, the question shifts from "why am I not getting ahead?" to "what is constantly pushing the baseline forward?" And this shift in perspective is subtle but important because it changes where attention is directed, moving away from isolated outcomes and toward underlying mechanisms. This does not imply that progress is impossible, but it does suggest that progress requires a different type of awareness, one that focuses on how financial systems evolve over time, rather than how individual moments appear in isolation. And this awareness allows for a more accurate interpretation of what is happening beneath the surface. In the end, the feeling that it is impossible to get ahead in 2026 is not simply a personal experience, but a reflection of a broader structural reality where income, costs, psychology, and economic systems are interacting in ways that make forward movement less visible, slower to accumulate, and more dependent on understanding the system itself rather than relying on assumptions that no longer fully apply. And once you begin to see that clearly, the feeling itself starts to make sense, not as a failure, but as a signal that the system has changed, and that understanding that change is the first step toward navigating it more effectively.